How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yomi Menachos, Daf 33, Masechta Menachos. Friends, today is all about mezuzahs. All about mezuzahs. We are going to discuss laws about writing mezuzahs, laws about how to put up mezuzahs, laws about where to put up mezuzahs. At some point on Lamed Gimel Beis, it gets like a full-on Eruvin. We're going to see lots of different interesting pictures about different mezuzah scenarios. So anyways, it's going to be an interesting one. There are 2, 4, 5 sections to today's daf. The first one is some more halachos on writing mezuzah. Okay, that will be at the very beginning of today's daf. We will learn about, some of these topics are actually kind of show up in different points throughout the daf. So on today's daf, we will be learning about determining which room is being entered, because that is basically the key determinant of which side the mezuzah goes, which side of the doorpost the mezuzah goes onto, right? If you imagine you have 2 rooms with a doorway in between them, so the mezuzah is supposed to be on the right side of which room? The right side of the room that's being entered. How do you define which room is being entered? So that will be discussed today. The placement of the mezuzah. Okay, so we define which room is being entered. Where in the door, where does the mezuzah go? Okay, you defined where it's entered. It's going to be going on the right side. The right side of what? Where? We will discuss that. When multiple mezuzahs are required for a room, right? If you have a room that there are multiple doors that open up into it, in what scenarios is a mezuzah required for each one of those doorways? In which scenarios maybe does a doorway not require a mezuzah? And finally, assorted mezuzah scenarios. This is a big one. There are a lot of assorted mezuzah scenarios. We're going to be seeing, as I mentioned, lots of photos of different scenarios. We're going to have to use our imaginations a little bit, because these photos were not taken with Daf 33 of Masechta Menachos in mind. But I'm confident that we will be able to make good use of them. Friends, let's jump in. Friends, before we begin, I actually just want to pull up a photo here of a doorway. I just want us to agree on nomenclature. I don't know if what I'm saying is correct. I do know that what I'm saying is what I'm going to be saying on this daf. So I just want to make sure that we all understand that when I say certain words, these are the things that I mean. This is a photo of a doorway, a very beautiful doorway that has been marked up with different arrows. The white arrows are pointing to what I'm calling the doorway, the doorpost. No, the whole thing is the doorway, but the doorposts, okay? The vertical door posts on the left and on the right of the doorway are the door posts, okay? In order for a doorway to be chayiv in a mezuzah, it needs door posts, okay? The white arrows are pointing to door posts. The pink arrow is pointing to what I'm calling a lintel. I didn't confirm that is a lintel. I'm calling it the lintel. When I say lintel, I mean the part above your head, the part of the doorway that's above your head when you walk through it. The top part. I guess when the Torah says by the Korban Pesach ala mashkov ala shtei mezuzos, I guess the shtei mezuzos are the doorways and the mashkov is the lintel. And the blue arrow is pointing to what I'm calling the threshold. I don't know if it is a threshold or if it isn't a threshold. It's a threshold for the next hour. So, friends, now that we have agreed on some nomenclature, let us begin. Friends, we begin on Daf Lamed Beis. Amid Beis, 2 lines before it gets wide. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kasva Igeres psula. If one writes a mezuzah as an igeres, as like a letter that one is writing to their friends, Rashi says that without sirtut, or without paying attention to how words are written properly, right? Maybe they leave out a vav, leave out a yud, right? They're sounding it out. I know it, right? They're just kind of writing it out. They're missing a letter here, missing a letter there. Apostle. Tosfos Taka asks, why would Rashi mention anything about not requiring sirtut? We already said it requires sirtut. We even said it's halachot Moshe Sinai. Anyways, Tosfos prefers the second option, which is if you write it just like you're writing a letter to your friend and you're not paying attention to chaseris via seris. So we're saying that it is possible. My time, how come? Asik ksiva me safer, because it says ksiva by uchsabtam mezuzahs b'sechu b'sharecha, and it says ksiva in the context of safers. For example, v'chosav l'sefer krisos by Gittin. For example, ksovzos zikaron b'sefer by Amalek. In places where it says safer, a safer is an official thing that has to be written properly, and therefore it says ksiva by uchsabtam mezuzahs b'sechu b'sharecha by mezuzah. It says ksiva in other contexts where a safer is required, and therefore it's got to be written properly and spelled properly and sirtuted properly, etc. V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, says Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Tula b'makol. If one hangs a mezuzah on a stick, so instead of hanging it in the doorway like we are familiar with, they take a stick and they put the stick, they lean it against the doorway, and they have a mezuzah hanging on the stick. Okay, creative option. I hear that. I would do that, Lamaise. I would probably do that. Like, instead of like getting nails and hammers and start, making permanent stuff, take a stick and just like tie it to a stick, and you can always take it, move it around. Honestly, like if I had to put up a mezuzah and I had an option to put it on a stick, I wouldn't rule that out. But I don't have the option. Psula, my time, we need it to be in your doorpost, not on a stick. If one hung a mezuzah on a stick, or put it on the wall behind the door. We need it to be in the doorway, not on the wall behind the door. Sakone, it's dangerous. What does it mean it's sakone? Ve'ein ba mitzvah, and it's no mitzvah. What does that mean? So Rashi has an interesting pshat here, which is it's sakana because, the mezuzah, as we're going to learn in Daf Yomi Menachos, protects from mazikin. A mezuzah protects us from mazikin. Now, if you put the mezuzah on a stick or on the wall instead of the doorpost, you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of mezuzah. If you're not fulfilling the mitzvah of mezuzah, then you're not getting the protection from the mazikin. If you're not getting the protection from the mazikin, it's dangerous. Tosfos Taka asks, wait a second, but then what's specific, manishtana, what's specific about hanging a mezuzah on a stick or putting it on the wall that's any different than writing it incorrectly or anything like that? Anytime a mezuzah is possible, it should be dangerous. What's unique about this scenario? So therefore, Tosfos prefers to say you can hit your head. If every single time you're walking into a room, you're passing by a stick with some parchment dangling off of it, it could poke you in the eye. I don't know. You can get hurt. It's dangerous. Shabez munbaz amelech ayu osin bepundikeun kein zecher li mezuzah. Now, in the by munbaz the king, so they would often be on the road, going to all the different places of the kingdom and making sure the people are happy, I'm sure. Anyways, so they would stay at pundaks, at kretschmers, at the finest kretschmers. And when you stay at a hotel, you obviously don't have to put up your own mezuzah if you're just sleeping overnight at a hotel. Nonetheless, by the munbaz, he would, even though he didn't have to put up a mezuzah on the hotel he was staying at, he would bring a mezuzah on a stick, and he would do the stick option. And apparently it wasn't dangerous because since he was putting it up and taking it down, it's dangerous when it's there all the time and you can keep on poking yourself in the eye, day, night. But over here, he was just putting up at night when he went to sleep for mazikin protection, and then he would pack it up in the morning. So therefore that wasn't an issue, and just so that he had mezuzahs around, he would put a mezuzah on a stick. Okay, at least just, what does it say? So before the guy, okay, zeicher lemitzvah. It doesn't say he was being yosef. Zeicher lemitzvah. Okay, givaldik. Mezuzah is a gewaldige thing. You want it to at least be mishtatev some way in the mitzvah of mezuzah. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel mitzvah la'anicha b'soich chalalo shel Pesach. It is a mitzvah that the mezuzah should be in the doorway. It's a mitzvah that the mezuzah should be in the doorway. Okay. Pshita, this is obvious. Bisharecha Amar Rachmana. The Torah says, Bisharecha, in your gates, in your doorways. Of course it should be in your doorway. Meaning, so sometimes it's not really possible, right? Sometimes you have I'm looking at my door frame over here. It's a very thin door frame. It's going to be difficult to get a mezuzah in the door frame. But very often between rooms, for example, there's like a proper tzuras Pesach, a proper thick doorway, half a foot, I don't know how wide it is. But there's a proper doorway. It should be in the doorway. Well, so why do we have to say this? Of course, it says Bisharecha. Sagadati Chamina, I may have thought Hov Amar Rav, since Rav says Mitzvah la'anicha b'tefach hasamuch l'reshus harabim. As we're going to see on Daf Yomi Menachos, Rav says that there's a mitzvah that the mezuzah should be in the tefach of the doorway that's closest to Reshus Harabim, so that immediately when you're walking into your house, right? So if right, you have a mezuzah on the entrance to your house, on the part that's closest to Reshus Harabim, so immediately upon entering your house, you're interacting with the mitzvah. Can you imagine? Right away, immediately upon entering your house, mitzvah. So therefore, Kamad Merachak Maile. I may have thought that being the case, let's put the mezuzah outside. Why put it in the doorway? Put it even outside the doorway. Mamish outside. Even before you get into the house, you're already interacting with the mitzvah. No. In Bisharecha, in the doorway. V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kosva al Shnei Dapin Psula. Says Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel that if the mezuzah is written on 2 columns, it is possible. If it's written on 2 columns, it is possible. It needs to be written in 1 column, like we saw yesterday, all in 1 column. Meisver of a contradiction. If he wrote the mezuzah on 2 columns, Shema in 1 column, Vayam Shema in another column, and then he cut them in half, and he put 1 parchment on one of the door posts and another parchment on the other door post, psula. But it sounds like 2 columns, so long as it's on 1 doorpost, should be okay. The issue is that he was putting it on 2 doorposts, no? So, no, that's not the issue. The issue is 2 columns. What it's saying is that 2 columns that are even fit to be put onto, meaning 2 columns, such that you could technically take a knife or a scissors and cut it in half and be able to put it on 2 doorposts, that's already an issue, even if you don't put it on 2 doorposts. 2 columns is a problem. Gewaldig. Okay. Now we're gonna discuss a bit the topic of determining which room is being entered. Now, this topic is actually going to come up again. There, as I mentioned in the introduction, a few of these topics are kind of going to be mentioned at one point, mentioned again. So we're going to discuss this topic now. We're also going to discuss it a little bit later. Determining which room is being entered. Shmuel says, Shmuel, b'mezuzah halech ach heker tzir. When it comes to mezuzah, you go based on the heker tzir. My heker tzir. What is a heker tzir? Amar of Ada av kisok. Says Rav Ada, it is a pivot. What is a pivot? So, Chevra, I have a image over here. This image is from a fellow called Ur Nansha. I assume that if I said Ur Nansha, he probably, I assume you wouldn't recognize that name. I'm sure I'm not saying it correctly. It's probably not Ur Nansha, but that's how it's spelled. And he had a door socket. Ur Nansha is a fellow who lived a very long time ago. Ur Nansha, he had a door socket. I don't know that he had very many things, but he had a door socket. And I cannot imagine that he would even be able to begin to comprehend what it means that his door socket is now on a slide on Babble on Talmud. Anyways, what this door socket is that at one point, and now it was very difficult for me to find an image of a door socket, which is really what I was looking for was not just a door socket. Really what I was looking for was a door that it revolves on a door socket. And I wasn't really finding anything. All I found was this pivot. I couldn't find the door. All I found was a pivot. Apparently, they created hinges very early on, because even the oldest doors that I saw were on hinges. Before the invention of the hinge, they had these pivots. And what you would have is, you would have, I didn't see a photo of a door on a pivot. So I'm imagining the way it works is you have a door. Now I had made a mistake. This is actually my second time recording this, because I made a whole bunch of mistakes. I said I have to re-record this whole section. Anyways, I thought that this was in the middle of the door, but apparently it was on the side of the door. So meaning it's kind of like a hinge on that it's the side of the door, and you open up the door from the side, and the whole entryway is open, except that they didn't invent hinges yet, and they had these pivots. So I guess you had a door is just like a piece of wood or something, and on the side of it you would have a peg on the going down, which would go into this hinge, into this pivot, and on the top I imagine you also have another peg sticking up, going into some other kind of hinge pivot on the top. So you have these two pegs and these two pivots, and the door swings in either direction, maybe against the doorpost or something like that. And it's kind of like a hinge, but it was the predecessor to hinges. They had these pivots. Givaldi. So what Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel is saying is that the location of this pivot is going to help us determine where the mezuzah goes. So let's see what the Gemara says. By mezuzah, you go after this hekrat tzir. My hekrat tzir, what is that? Amar of Ada Avkasa, it's this pivot. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means, so imagine a house with 2 rooms. Now, if this house with 2 rooms was basically a front room and a back room, i.e. there was only one entrance into this house, and you would come in from the street into the front room, and from the front room you would enter into the back room, well then there's no question, there's nothing to talk about. Obviously you're going to put the mezuzah on the right side of the doorway as you go into the back room. You're going to be putting the mezuzah in the room that you're entering into. And since the only way to enter into the back room is through the front room, so therefore when entering from the front room into the back room, the mezuzah is going to be on your right side. Done deal. There's no question about where to put the mezuzah, on your right side when entering from the front room into the back room. In this case, however, there were entrances from the outside into either room. You could enter in so now in this case though, we're talking about this men's room, women's room. What are we talking about? So we're talking about kind of similar to like Avraham Avinu when he was entertaining the Malachim. It says where was it? Vayei Sarah Ishtecha. Right? It says Yineba. Right? She's in the tent. So he was outside entertaining the guests, and she was doing her thing, doing whatever she was doing in the tent in her own space. So the men's room and the women's room is that. Not necessarily only men are allowed or only women are allowed, but it was the men's room was a room that if the man was entertaining his friends or whatever, he would do that in that room, and the woman would have her own room to be able to have her own space and do whatever she's doing in her room while the man is entertaining in his room. That's the man's room and the women's room. Whenever they're alone, just them, it's just their house. There's no man's room and women's room. It's just a way to reference these 2 rooms. Now, so the question is, okay, now it's just them in the house. Forget nobody's entertaining any guests. The question is, how do we determine now which room which room are you going to be considered entering into, and where is the mezuzah going to be, right? Because the mezuzah is going to be on the right side when entering into one of the rooms. Are you considered entering into the women's room from the man's room, or are you considering entered into the man's room from the women's room? How do we determine that? So the answer is that we determine it based on where is this pivot. Is the pivot on the side of the doorway going right on that is closer right on the woman's room side of the doorway, or is it on the man's room side of the doorway? Whichever side that is, that will be considered the inner room. So if the pivot is on the side of the doorway that is closer to the women's room, well then the women's room would be considered the inner room, which means that when entering into the women's room from the men's room, you are going to have the mezuzah on your right. A men's room that has a mezuzah. Givaldi. If anybody ever asks, where do you find a men's room with a mezuzah? Daf Yomi Gimel of Masechta Menachos. Anyways, so that's what we're saying. So for example, the doorway between two houses, in this case two rooms, for example, between the men's room and the women's room. In this case, how are we going to determine which room is going to be considered entered into? The answer is the room that is being entered into is the room which has the pivot in it. Reish Galusa Bonabesa, Reish Galusa built a house on the Rav Nachman, and he says to Rav Nachman, his son-in-law, Kava li mezuzah, put up my mezuzahs for me. Rav Nachman says, Tali dashe beresha, you first need to put up a doorway. So there's a machlokes with Rashi and Tosfos. What exactly this means? Rashi says this is talking about something else. We're going to learn on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, Taiseh v'lo min ha'asui. That when it comes to mezuzah, there is a concept, just like by sukkah, there's a concept of Taiseh v'lo min ha'asui, right? Chag HaSukkah is Taiseh l'cha shivas yomim, I think it says, that you have to make a sukkah. And let's say you have your sukkah already from last year, you're going to have to do something to make it like you're making it for this year. You have to make a sukkah. So here also by mezuzah, there's a similar halacha. I don't really understand why it doesn't say anywhere to make a mezuzah like ta'aseh, but I guess it says uchsavtam mezuzos beisechu v'sharecha. I guess it assumes maybe that you already have a doorway and you make a mezuzah for that doorway. So the Reish Galusa had said to his son-in-law Rav Nachman, put up mezuzahs for me. Rav Nachman says, wait, if I put up mezuzahs now before you put up proper doorways, doorposts and lintels, well then, when the doorway is made, the mezuzahs will have already been made, and you need to make the mezuzahs for your doorway. So you first have to put up a doorway. Tosfos says that it doesn't make sense that this Gemara then would be here, since we talk about Taiseh v'lo min ha'asui an Lamed Gimel Amud Beis. Why would this be here? Rather, it makes more sense to say that it's going on what we just said about the men's room and the women's room. Rather, what Rav Nachman was saying is, I don't know where to put up the mezuzahs, which rooms are primary, which is the inner, which is outer. Put up the doorways, and based on where the doors are, I'll be able to tell where to put the mezuzah. Okay. Givaldi. Amar Yehuda Amar Rab, I saw Kimin Neger Psula. If the mezuzah is like a bolt, it is psula. Okay, that means, I believe, I'm understanding it to mean just simply our mezuzah are put up vertically on the doorpost, on the doorpost. This was put horizontally. Instead of putting it up straight, it was put up side to side, I think. Ini, is this really the case? Vaki also, Reb Yitzchak bar Yosef, when Reb Yitzchak bar Yosef came from Eretz Yisrael to Babble, he said, Kula mezuzto devei Rebbe Kimin Neger Havu Avdin or Avidan. All of the mezuzahs by Rebbe's house were like these bolts. Additionally, by Pischa the Ayobei Rebbe Levei Midrasha Lo Avola Mezuzah. Additionally, another interesting thing is that the entryway that Rebbe would walk through to walk into the Beis HaMedrash did not have a mezuzah. We will get back to that. Lo kash, it's no problem. Or Davida besichto, or Davida kisichto, or Davida ki istvira. In terms of the bolt thing, it depends. If it is like a peg, i.e., if it's horizontal, so if the mezuzah is not standing vertically but rather lying horizontally in the doorway, so then I hope I understand that right. That is no good. What Rebbe had, his was like an ankle, like your leg going into your ankle. It's like vertical, and then maybe at the bottom, I guess your ankle goes 90 degrees. But since there is part of it that's vertical, that is acceptable. Pischa te'av. Where am I? Ini. Now, is it so that Rebbe, the doorway that he would enter the Beis HaMedrash from, did not have a mezuzah? V'ahu pischa dehava ayil ba Rav Huna levei midrasha. Rav Huna, when he would go to the Beis HaMedrash, he would go through this doorway. V'havya la mezuzah, and his doorway had a mezuzah. So why did Rebbe's doorway not have a mezuzah? Hahu ragil Hava. Well, the difference is that the doorway that Rav Huna would go through to get into the Beis HaMedrash was the common doorway, was the main doorway. The Amar V'Yudah Amar Rab, says V'Yudah Amar Rab, b'mezuzah alech acher haragil. That when it comes to mezuzah, you go based on the norm. And therefore, if the common entry way into a room is, if a particular door is the common door to go through, so then it will get the mezuzah. So Rav Huna's doorway was the main doorway, so of course it had a mezuzah. Rebbe's was his own private doorway, and we'll have more on that later. But anyways, suffice it to say that by Rebbe's Beis HaMedrash, there was a different door that was the main door. Rebbe had his own private entrance into the Beis HaMedrash. His private entrance did not have a mezuzah. Again, more on that later. Friends, now we are going to discuss the topic of placement of the mezuzah. We already discussed it a little bit earlier in terms of putting it in the doorway. Now we are going to discuss more about it. Amar B'zera says, B'zera Amar Rav Masna Amar Shmuel Mitzvah La'anicha B'tchilas Shlish Ha'elyon. That the mitzvah is to put the mezuzah at the beginning of the top third of the doorway. Okay, so let's say the doorway is, I don't know, what's the standard doorway height? Maybe like 8 feet, 10 feet, let's say 9 feet. Easy to work with. So up from the ground, 6 feet up from the ground is where you would put your mezuzah. At the beginning of the top third of the doorway. Rav Huna Amar says, Rav Huna Magbiya min hakarka tefach u'marchik min hakor tefach b'chol ha'pesach kulo kosher l'mezuzah. Rav Huna says, so long as the mezuzah is not within a tefach of the top of the, as long as the mezuzah is not within a tefach of the lintel or within a tefach of the threshold, it could be anywhere along the height of the doorway. Again, so long as it is not within a tefach of either extremity. Meisvei, however, we have a contradiction to Shmuel, who says the top third. Matbiya min hakarka tefach u'marchik min hakora tefach v'chol ha'pesach kulo kosher l'mezuzah divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says exactly like Rav Huna says. I.e., Rav Huna is saying exactly like Rabbi Yehuda, that you could put the mezuzah anywhere on the doorway, so long as it is not within the first tefach, as long as it's not within a tefach of either the lintel or the threshold. Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi, ukshartem uchsavtem, says Rabbi Yossi, that it says ukshartem osam losayet, ukshartem osam losayet. I don't know, there's two psukim, one in Shema, one in Shema. Wait, I think I want the one from Shema. Ukshartem losayet, ukshartam losayet, vayu l'totafos beinenecha, uchsavtem ha-mezuzos b'secha v'sherecha. So it says ukshartam, uchsavtam, just like the tefillin are at the top of your head, so also the mezuzah in the very next pasuk is at the top of the doorway. Again, ukshartam, uchsavtam, akshira, begova, just like the tying of the tefillin is at the top of one's head. Af ksiva begova, so the writing of the mezuzah, uchsavtam ha-mezuzos b'secha v'sherecha, is begova at the top of the doorway. Bishlam Rav Huna, I understand Rav Huna, who says anywhere on the doorway, at the height, within essentially anywhere within the height of the doorway. Huda Amar Kit, Rabbi Yehuda is saying exactly like what Rabbi Yehuda says. He's aligned with Rabbi Yehuda. Ella l'Shmuel the Amar Kaman. Who's Shmuel saying? Like nobody said within the top third. Lok Rabbi Yehuda, Lok Rabbi Yossi, like neither Rabbi Yehuda nor Rabbi Yossi. Amar Rav Huna, brother of Nosin. The Olam ki Rabbi Yossi, really Rav Huna holds like Rabbi Yossi. Umay Tchilas Shlish Elyon Dika Amar. Why is Shmuel talking about the beginning of the top third of the doorway? La'archika. It's saying that's as far away from the top as you can go. So la'archika min hakora shel mayla yosem mishlish, that it should not be more than a third of the way from the lintel. So therefore, Rabbi Yossi says that just like tefillin is at the top of your head, so the mezuzah is at the top of the doorway. And comes Shmuel to say, and the top of the doorway is basically anywhere from the top of the doorway. I mean, Rabbi Yossi didn't seem to say anything about a tefach. From the top of the doorway, we're going to see what the Shulchan Aruch says in a second. But from the top of the doorway, it's considered to the top all the way. You can go far away from the lintel up to a third of the way. So if we use our example of 9 feet tall, so basically you want the mezuzah to be at the top. and it could be as far as 3 feet away, kilu, 6 feet up from the ground. Omar Ravit says, Ravit, mitzvah la'anicha b'tefach hasamuch l'reshus arabim. It is a mitzvah to put the mezuzah in the tefach that is nearest, in the tefach of the doorway that is nearest to reshus arabim. My time will come. Rabbanan Nami, the rabbis say, Kadesha Yivga b'mezuzah, or alternative text say, b'mitzvah miyad, so that immediately when coming into your home, you should be interacting with the mitzvah, with the mezuzah, which is a mitzvah. You should be interacting with it right away. Rav Chanina Misura Omer says, Rav Chanina Misura ki echi disintere, so that it should protect you. That the mezuzah says, Rashi, the chol habayis min hamazikin, the whole bias from the mazikin, and you want, therefore, I guess, to get the mezuzah up as soon as possible in the first tefach, in the entryway right away. You want to get that mezuzah up and get that protection going. Chevra, I just want to, before we wrap up this section, I want to have a look at the Shulchan Aruch. Simin Reish Pei Tes Saif Beis, who kind of gives a summary for the halachos that we just learned. Ezu Makom Kviyasa, where does the mezuzah go, friends? B'sochalul shel Pesach, within the doorway, as we've said. B'tefach hasamuch lachutz, in the tefach that is closest to the outside, as we just saw. Says the Ramah b'mshina eino ma'akev, if it's not within that specific tefach, but it is within the doorway, yanichena b'mezuzah atzma, as long as it's within the doorway, that's also fine. But it should be within the tefach that's closest to Rishus Harabim, that to the outside. B'tchilas shlish ha'elyon gova ashar, at the beginning of the top third of the doorway. So if it's a 9-foot doorway at 6 feet up, the imkava l'mayla mizeh ksheira, and if it's above 6 feet, if it's above 2/3 of the way up, if it's higher up than the beginning of the top third, it's still ksheira. That's also fine. Higher than that is also fine, like we saw from Rabbi Yossi. Vusha yarchikena me'amashkiv tefach, but you should still keep it at a distance from the lintel, a tefach. So you could put the mezuzah anywhere from a tefach away from the lintel until the end of the top third of the doorway. And then he says, v'tzarich likova al yad yamin, etc. Vim kava b'svol psula. It has to be on the right side. If it's on the left side, it's possible. But we haven't gotten there really in the Gemara about the requirement for the right side. But yeah, it does need to be on the right side. Chevra, that was the halacha in the Shulchan Aruch to kind of wrap up what we just learned. Halacha lemaise. And Rab Chanina adds one final shtickle, Borei Shalok midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu midas basav adam, that the way of the Rabbeinu Shalom is not like the way of the people. Midas basav adam, the way of the people, Melech Yoshim b'fnim ba'am shamid osim v'chutz. The king sits inside and he has people protecting him. He has his people protecting him from the outside. Midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu enikein, with the Rabbeinu Shalom it's fakert. Avodav Yoshvim b'fnim, the Yidden sit inside their homes, v'u'mishamim v'chutz, and the Rabbeinu Shalom protects them from outside. Shneimar Hashem Shomrecha Hashem Tzilcha Al Yad Yiminecha, that the Rabbeinu Shalom guards us and saves us. Al Yad Yiminecha, on from his right hand, which maybe is a reference to the Yad Yiminecha to the right side of the doorway for the mezuzah. I don't know, but the Rabbeinu Shalom takes care of us. Friends, it is at this point that the daf takes a bit of a Eruvin kind of turn. We are going to have a lot of just figuring out what structures look like. We'll have a whole bunch of photos to help us. As I mentioned earlier, we might have to use our imaginations a little bit. Here we go. Darish of Yosef says of Yosef Brei de Rove Mishmei de Rove Hemikla Tefach Psula. If the mezuzah is 1 tefach deep in, it's psula. If I understand correctly, it means this. So here is a place for a mezuzah on the stone door frame, says the photo. And if you notice where the pink arrow is pointing to, there's basically an indentation where a mezuzah, doesn't look like there's a mezuzah there now, but there's a doorway and there is a place where the mezuzah would have been. Now I imagine what it's saying is that if that indentation goes one tefach deep in, and the mezuzah is a tefach deep into the door frame, into the doorpost, so then that would be no good. I think that's what it's saying. So again, Dosh of Yosef Brei Derav Mishmei Derava Hemikla Tefach Psula. Okay, let's say that the following supports that notion. Hinicha a bit patzin, if the mezuzah was placed in a board, Oshe Tala Aleya Malbin, or you kind of covered it with bricks. You kind of covered it with like a brick. So I guess you put up put the mezuzah somewhere, and then kind of put bricks, covered it in bricks, and now it's like a tefach underneath the bricks, covered by the bricks. Im yesh sham tefach, if we're talking about that it's a tefach away from the surface, so then tzarich mezuzah acheres, you're gonna have to put up a different mezuzah, because the mezuzah that's a tefach in is not usable, is not kosher. Im lav enu tzarich mezuzah acheres, if it's not a tefach in, so then you don't need another mezuzah, you can use that mezuzah. To which the Gemara answers, no, that brisa is not a raya. Kitanya yi bepesach shachori adelis. That brisa is talking about a pesach achori adelis. Friends, what does that mean? What is a pesach achori adelis? So here we have a photo. I think that this photo is of an H&M store in China. Now, the reason why this photo has made its way to Babble on Talmud is because of technical reasons. Its doors are this Achore a Pesach configuration. Now, we have to use our imaginations a little bit. Let's imagine that this was not such a fancy, elaborate whole architecture thing. Let's imagine that this was like a pretty primitive kind of door a long time ago, just to simplify things. So you got like basically a square little beam there that somebody knocked into the ground with a hammer. And on either side, there's basically a door. So you have like, let's say, a square house, a pretty simple square house. And in this corner over here, you have like a beam. And so now with the gold arrow is pointing, you have like a little door on that side. And where the blue arrow is pointing, you have a door on that side. And where the pink arrow is pointing, that's the beam that's kind of in the corner. And what happens is, with the gold, where the gold arrow is pointing, that primitive door, when you open it up, it's now covering the door where the blue arrow is pointing. And vice versa. When you open the blue door, it covers, when it's open, it's covering where the door by the gold arrow is pointing. That is basically our configuration. You have these two doors in a corner, and that's the idea. So now what we're saying is that what if you put a mezuzah on the doorway where the gold arrow is? So you're not walking into a store in our case, you're walking into your house, and your house has this interesting configuration, and there's two doors to get into the house, and you put a mezuzah on the door where the gold arrow is pointing. You put a mezuzah on the right side of the door. The question is, do you also need to put a mezuzah on the door where the blue arrow is pointing? Can we say that once you already put up it's like all one door with a beam in the middle, but it's one door, and the mezuzah put up on the right side of the gold arrow door is the only mezuzah that's necessary? So the answer is that where the pink arrow is pointing, that white thing, our beam there in the middle, if it's what do we say? We say a tefach, we're talking about, right? If that beam is a tefach, so then the doors would be considered separate, and each door, the blue arrow door, the gold arrow door, each would require their own mezuzah. If that beam was not a tefach, then the mezuzah that was put up on the gold arrow door would work for both of them. And in terms of the bricks, we're saying even if the beam itself was not a tefach, but you added bricks to it and now it's a tefach, so also it would be considered a tefach that then we would require separate mezuzahs, and that's what this achori adelis thing is. Okay. So the Gemara asks, but the achori adelis was explicitly taught in that brisa afterwards when it says Pesach shachori adelis, that when you have this behind the door situation like we just described, im yesh sham tefach tzarich mezuzah, if that beam in the corner has a tefach, it requires a mezuzah. Mezuzah acheres, two separate mezuzahs. Ve'im lav, if it's not a tefach, enu tzarich mezuzah acheres, it doesn't require another mezuzah. Keitzad katani. The Gemara answers that the Brisa is just explaining what the ratio was. So the ratio talked about this tefach, and right, what did the ratio say? Hinicha bepatzin or shetola le'amalbein or yesha tefach, no tefach, bricks, whatever. What does it mean? So the Sefer comes to explain what it means, that it's talking about this achori adelis, and that if there's a tefach in that beam in the middle or whatever. Okay, but it's all talking about one thing, and it is in fact talking about achori adelis. It's not necessarily a raya to say that in the previous photo that we saw about where there's the mezuzah goes into the doorway, a tefach. In the photo it didn't go tefach, but we're talking about if we push it in a tefach into the doorpost, we had said that it's possible, so this would not be a raya for that. Continues the Gemara, Tana was talking about Brisa, He'emid la malbin shalkanim. So if a doorway of reeds was erected, chotech shvoferes umanicha, so you can cut out into the reeds and put the mezuzah in there. So I have a photo here. These are there's two photos here. There's a photo on the left, and the photo on the right is the same photo, just zoomed in. So the photo on the left, we see a whole bunch of reeds. On the photo on the right, we've zoomed in a bit, and you can see that on a reed, there's like different sections to it, right? You can see on the right. So I kind of circled, I ovaled two such reeds. So if we look at the reed on the left, so you notice that towards the bottom of the oval, there's a black dot. And towards the top of the oval, there's another black dot. Those demarcate different sections of the reed. Now, if I understand correctly, I watched some videos about bamboo. This seems to be the case with bamboo. Maybe somebody who knows can confirm. I did not have a reed available to test on myself, but my understand, based on my little research I did with bamboo, is that the same thing would be the case with reeds, which is that if you open up the reed in between the knots, those are called nodes. I think they are called nodes. Although I don't remember exactly the terms. But basically in between those black dots, I think the reed is hollow, is open. But where those black dots is, they're actually closed. So like, for example, I think you can make like a cup out of bamboo by just like cutting a bamboo thing and leaving the knot there, or the node, or whatever it's called, and then you have like a surface in a like cylinder with like a bottom on it, I think, something like that. Anyways, so what you do is you have this doorway made of reeds, and so what you do is you take a knife and you cut open the reed probably towards where that black knot is, and like this, it's empty, it's hollow inside with already like a floor. And you place the parchment inside of the reed on the right side of the door. So you go around the way into the house, whatever. You have reeds on the right side. You take a knife, cut open one of the reeds, put in a cloth. It's resting there. Givaldik. Again, Tana Emid lo malbin shalkonim. So if you make a doorway of reeds, chotech shvoferes, you can cut open one of the sections, umanicha, and you can put the cloth in there. Now, this is only if the doorway of reeds was already erected and then the cloth was placed in. But if you had while the doorway was not yet erected, and the reeds were just kind of lying on the floor waiting to be erected, and the cloth was placed into one of the reeds at that point, ulvasof emid, and then afterwards you put up the doorway, psula, then that would be posel taisev lo mina asui, because you have to make the mezuzah, not that it's already been made. I don't know, Rashi doesn't say anything about this taisev lo mina asui. He says on the previous page that it's learned from tzitzis. I don't know, maybe we're going to learn more about it later. I don't really understand why specifically taisev lo mina asui applies to mezuzah, but I don't know, maybe because uchsaftam, you have to write it on mezuzahs pesecha, and therefore you have to have the doorway and then write the mezuzah for the doorway, not that you put up the doorway and the mezuzah's already been written for it. You have to write the mezuzah for the doorway. Okay. But Rava says, Rava, Hane Pischei Shimai, P'tur min mezuzah. Pischei Shimai don't require mezuzah. My Pischei Shimai, what are those? Pligiba Rav Richumi ve'Abba Yossi. It's machlekes of Rav Richumi and Abba Yossi. Chadamer deleislu tikra, v'chadamer deleislu shkufe. Okay. One says that there's no lintel, the other one says that there's no doorposts. So you have to have doorposts and a lintel. If you don't have doorposts and a lintel, you don't put up a mezuzah. Omar Rabba bar Shila, Omar Rav Chizda Achsadra p'tur min mezuzah. An Achsadra does not require a mezuzah. An Achsadra is a structure that is closed on three sides, and it is open on the fourth side. When entering the Achsadra from the open fourth side, you do not need to have a mezuzah on the doorway. The Vishaina Ptimin, because it doesn't have doorposts. Since the opening into the Achsadra does not have doorposts, it does not require a mezuzah. Hayeshla Ptimin Chayeves. But what do you mean? Who cares about the doorposts? Even if it had doorposts, it should not be chayiv in mezuzah. L'chizuk tikra hu da'avide. Even if there were beams there, standing up beams, they wouldn't be as doorposts. They would just be to support the roof, not as doorposts. So why should it require a mezuzah? This is what Rav Chizda is saying, that when it comes to the Achsadra, even though there are beams at the ends of the opening of the Achsadra, P'tura, it is potter from a mezuzah, she'ein asuyin ela l'chizuk l'tikra, because those beams are there to support the roof rather than as doorposts. Abai says, Abai, chazina lehu, Le'isplide deveimar, I've witnessed that the achsadras of Rabbah, the islu ptzime, that they have supports for the roof, v'leislu mezuzahs, and no mezuzahs were put on those beams because they were just simply kasavar lechizik tikrahu davide, because they were there to support the roof rather than as door posts. Meisve. However, we have a contradiction. Beis sha'ar achsadra umerpeses. A beis sha'ar. We're going to be talking about beis sha'ars now for the next few lines. Beis sha'ars are, of course, a concept that we learned about way back when in Masechta Eruvin. Gonna drink a little water. A beis sha'ar is, imagine you have a chatzer, a courtyard. Remember chatzers? Eruvin, Shabbos, even Masechta Sukkah. We learned about these things a long time ago. So you have a courtyard, there are houses that open up into the courtyard, people live in the courtyard, and in this particular courtyard they have a doorman. Not like the doorman in this week's Parsha, of course, that we all know about, the Eved Ivri, who we nail him to the door. By the way, I realized a shtickle chiddush with that. I was doing Shnai Mikra V'Echad Targum, and I realized that we don't just nail him to the door post, we nail him to the actual door. So everybody comes in and out, he's got to get up. This chutzner has a doorman, and this doorman has a little hut. I mean, as you can imagine, I don't know, where do we see these things? You know, that like when you go into a place, there's some guy sitting there in some booth, he says, hey, what do you want? This is that guy. And the way that you get into this booth that he sits in, you don't get him from the outside, you get him from the chatzer. So if he's obviously allowed into the chatzer, and from the chatzer he enters into this booth, and there's this booth that opens up into the chatzer. And that's where this shomer, that's where this guy sits, and he learns, and he's sitting there learning, and whenever anybody wants to come in, he says, "Who are you?" Okay, and then he gets back to his learning. Now, so that's a base chart. Achsadra we just talked about, with the 3 closed sides and the open sides. Mirpeset is kind of like, I imagine, kind of like a motel kind of thing. Like when you have let's say a 2-story motel, there's basically a whole bunch of doors into these rooms, and there's a second level, and you walk up the stairs to the second level, and there's a mirpeset there, which is basically like a walkway, and from that walkway you can enter into any of the upstairs rooms. So that's this mirpeset that we're talking about. Okay. Chayovin b'mezuzah, we do need to make a mezuzah on these. So it's a shayla, because we had just said that the achsadras don't need a mezuzah. Now we just said, Beis Shar achsadra, u'mirpeset chayovin b'mezuzah, you need a mezuzah. V'achsadra devei Rav. Well, that's because the achsadras is talking about there were closed on all 4 sides. They were just open towards the top. There was like space between the top of the wall and the roof, but they were in fact closed on all 4 sides. Achsadra devei Rav ki indruna me'al yaso. But achsadra devei Rav, that's closed on all 4 sides, is just a proper room. Of course it needs a mezuzah. Be'achsadra romisa, it is a Roman achsadra. What is a Roman achsadra? So I have a photo here of a Roman achsadra. Hopefully this is actually what a Roman achsadra is, but I tried to match the description. This looks Roman. This is what's called the big Roman bath. So it must be Roman, and what that blue arrow is pointing to is all those windows there in that wall. So we're talking about some kind of thing that was closed on all 4 sides, but so this is not closed on all 4 sides, but we're talking about something that was closed on all 4 sides, but there were these windows on all 4 sides. So we're talking about this Roman achsadra kind of thing that's closed on all 4 sides, but because it's got these kind of windows on all 4 sides, and we're saying, so in that case we're saying that it needs a mezuzah because even though there's like those windows, but it is closed on all 4 sides. Amar Yehuda says Amar Rachba, Amar Yehuda, Bei Arzike chayev b'shtei mezuzahs, Bei Arziki. Interesting. I feel like, friends, does Rav Yehuda say stuff on his own often? Or are people often quoting him, or is he often quoting other people? You have Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. You have people quoting Rav Yehuda, right? I think people quote Rav Yehuda. Over here we have Amar Rachba, Amar Rav Yehuda. I feel like other people quote Rav Yehuda. Does Rav Yehuda ever say stuff on his own? I don't know. Let's keep an eye out on that. Probably. But I just thought of that as we were reading that. Amar Rachba, Amar Rav Yehuda, Be'arzike chayev b'shtei mezuzahs. Be'arzikes need 2 mezuzahs. My be'arzike, what's be'arzike? Amar Papa says, Papa Save Mishmei de Rab Beis Shar. Okay, this gatehouse, like we were talking about, this little hut that opens up into the courtyard. Hapasuach lichotzer, that is open up into a courtyard. Uvatim psuchim the Beis Shar, but it's also open up into the house that's adjacent. So we're talking about this little guard hut that you can enter in from the courtyard, but also it's adjacent. I was imagining almost like a garage, right? Meaning this is not a garage. It's a gatehouse. It's a completely different thing. But there's my garage growing up, you couldn't go into our house from the garage. You had to go outside to get into the garage. But I have been in people's garages where you can enter into the garage either through the garage door, like the big door where the cars go in, but there's also a door that you can go to and fro between the garage and the house. So there's basically 2 ways to get into the garage: from the outside world in your car or whatever, or you can come in from the house, from wherever the door is, the kitchen, wherever the door is that enters into the garage from the house. The point being, you have this garage that you can enter into 2 ways. Okay, now back to our gatehouse, which is not a garage, it's a gatehouse for this guard guy. So there's 2 ways to get into this gatehouse. So you can enter into it from the adjacent house, you can enter into this booth, you can also enter in from the courtyard, and we're saying that in that case it requires 2 mezuzahs. Do we read also okay, so you can get in from either the courtyard or from the adjacent house. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Beis Shara Pasuach Legina V'Likitonis. Okay, now we have a scenario where you have a room in a house. There is a room in a house, and outside of the house there's a beautiful garden. The room does not open up directly into the beautiful garden. It opens up into a sort of gatehouse, we're calling it, but a kind of little room, like a transition kind of room, maybe like a mud room or something. I don't know. You don't go directly from the room into the garden. You go through this a smaller room out into the garden. Now, Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi, Nidon Kikitonis, says Rabbi Yossi that this, I'll call it the gatehouse because I don't know what else to call it. This gatehouse, but this kind of like smaller room, this gatehouse needs a mezuzah. Just like the room in the house needs a mezuzah. The point is it's considered like the outside and it does not need a mezuzah. So now, again, this gatehouse, you can enter in from this room in the house. You can also enter in / go out to the garden. Now, in terms of the doorway between the house and the gatehouse, obviously it needs a mezuzah. The house needs a mezuzah, and when you enter in from the gatehouse into this room in the house, there is going to be a mezuzah on the right side when entering into the room. Right? It would be considered like you're entering into the room of the house, and it would be on the right side as you enter into the room of the house. The question here is, do you need a mezuzah between the garden and the gatehouse? That's the question. Rabbi Yossi says that we treat the gatehouse like the house, and yes, it does need a mezuzah. The Chachamim say that we treat the gatehouse like the outside, and it does not need a mezuzah. Now, Rav and Shmuel say, Migina lebayis kule amalo plige dechayev. Now, remember that pivot? What was that guy's name? Remember Nansh's door socket? Remember that? So if the door socket is in the gatehouse, says Rav and Shmuel, if the door socket is in the gatehouse, everyone agrees you will need a mezuzah in the doorway. Migina lebayis, what this means is that if basically the door socket is in the gatehouse, everybody agrees the chayav that you're going to need a mezuzah. My time outcome, because it's going to be considered like you're coming in to the house, into the gatehouse, and you need a mezuzah. Ki plige, where they argue is me bias legina. What if the pivot is in the garden? Mar Savar, Rabbi Yossi holds, Kitonis Iker, that the house is the Iker. Because Rabbi Yossi says, look, when we were talking about Nanshi's door socket earlier, that was, if you remember, with the men's room and the women's room. In that case, they were both equal. That was the whole challenge over there, is that you both have their own entryways to the outside world that you can enter into them from. So is it considered like you're going, so which is the main room? You're going from the man's room to the women's room? You're going from the women's room to the man's room? How do we determine? In that case, all things equal, we determine by the door socket. In this case, though, these are fundamentally different environments. One is a built-up structure. One is a garden. In this context, it will be considered like you're going in from the garden into this structure that requires a mezuzah. Even though the Ur Nansh's door socket is out in the garden. Umar Savar, Gina Iker, whereas the Chacham say, no, we still go by Ur Nansh's door socket, and no mezuzah is required. Rav Yosef, Rabbi and Rav Yosef, however, say, Mibayis Lagina, that if Ur Nansh's door socket is in the garden, everyone agrees the potter. Everyone agrees it's potter. Ur Nansh's door socket is out in the garden. No mezuzah is necessary in this doorway. My time outcome, Pischa Degina, who? Because the door is to the garden. Ki plige, where they argue is Migina Lebayis, when if Ur Nanshi's door socket is in the gatehouse. Marsavar Bia Debayis, who? Rabbi Yossi in this case says we go after Ur Nanshi's door socket. Ur Nanshi's door socket is in the house, therefore the doorway will require a mezuzah. Umaysaver kule adaita degina hu davida. Whereas the Chacham say the whole point of this gatehouse is in service of going out to the garden and is there because of the garden, and it's for the garden. The main thing is the garden, which is why the structure was erected in the first place, for the garden, for getting to the garden, and therefore it's judged like the garden, and it does not require a mezuzah. Abaye v'Rava avdei k'Rabba Rav Yosef. Abaye and Rava did like Rabba and Rav Yosef. Rav Ashi avdei k'Rav Shmuel l'chumra. Rav Ashi did like Rav and Shmuel l'chumra. Because what did Rav and Shmuel say? Rav and Shmuel said that everyone agrees that when Ur Nanshi's door socket is in the room, Rav and Shmuel said everyone agrees that it requires a mezuzah. So if the door socket is in the room, in the gatehouse, everyone agrees it requires a mezuzah. And the machlokas was when the door socket is outside. And there Rabbi Yossi said that still the room requires a mezuzah, and Rav Ashi says like Rabbi Yossi there that yes, the room requires a mezuzah. Idmar was stated, Lul pasuach min abayis laliyah. This is so Eruvini, right? All these different structures and like piecing them together. This time though we have a lot more slides, which I think makes it, at least we have the tools to understand it. I think when we learned Eruvin, I was just kind of like saying, this is what it is. Good luck. At least we have the tools here to be able to get on the same page. Now, this next scenario is talking about where you have, let's say you have two couples and they're friends, right? You have two couples. We don't need to say their names. It doesn't matter what their names are. Two couples, and they live in two apartments, one above the other. And there is a hatch in the floor of the upper apartment, and through that hatch, they can go down to the lower apartment, and vice versa. From the lower apartment, they can go up to the upper apartment. And there's, I'm imagining like a spiral kind of staircase that you walk up the spirals, up to the hatch, through the hatch, you're now in the upper apartment. And it's very convenient, it's great. They have a great time. They like living next to each other and being neighbors. They go up and down all the time. However, they don't want that people should be able to just come in and out whenever they want. They also do want some privacy. So what they have here is that in the lower apartment, by the stairs, they enclose it in like, there's just a little, they just enclose it and they put a door on it so that the people from upstairs, will have to come down and at the very least knock. They can't just come in whenever they want. And potentially there is such a thing upstairs as well, that if the lower apartment wants to go up the stairs and through the door, they will also be in a little enclosed area with a door, and they will also have to knock. The shaila is, do these little enclosed areas require mezuzahs? So Ibar was stated, lul, this staircase, pasuach, that's open min abayis la'aliyah, from the lower apartment to the upper apartment. Ravuna says, Ravuna im yesh lo pesach echad, if only the lower apartment has this enclosure, chay b'mezuzah achas, so there's going to be a requirement for one mezuzah. Im yesh lo beis pischin, if there are two doors, i.e. if there's an enclosure in the lower apartment, but the upper apartment also has its own enclosure, chay b'shtei mezuzahs, you need two mezuzahs. Amr Papa says, Papa shmamina midravuna, that we learn from Ravuna, indrona, that this chamber, the islay arba above it, that has four openings into it, chay b'arba mezuzahs, requires four mezuzahs. Pshita, of course, requires four mezuzahs. Lo tzricha af agav derogel b'chad, even though one is the main one. Okay, a few things to say about this. Okay. Number one, what did we just say? We just said that basically, let's say in your house, your living room, you can enter in from the kitchen. You can also enter in from the main doorway to the house, right? You open on the main doorway to the house. On the right side, you can walk into your living room. You can also get into the living room from your kitchen. Who knows? Maybe there's another way that you can get it. Maybe from the den too. Maybe there's three ways to get into your living room. Now, people don't usually come in from the den or whatever. Even though one of them is primary, let's say, still, since you can enter into the living room from these different ways, these different doorways, all the doors will require mezuzahs. Now, next thing. We had seen earlier, I said we would get back to this. Rebbe, we had said that Rebbe, when he enters into the Beis HaMedrash, his doorway didn't have a mezuzah. Why is that? We had said because it's not the primary one. We just said that even the non-primary ones need a mezuzah. So the thing is, Rebbe's was private. It was just for him to enter into the Beis HaMedrash. It was only for him to enter in. Therefore, in that case, because it was completely private, we say it doesn't require a mezuzah. I don't know what the halacha is lamaisa there, but that is why Rebbe didn't have a mezuzah on that door. And number 3, what has this got to do with these 2 apartments and the 2 couples who are friends but also wanted privacy? Meaning, we said there, if the lower level is enclosed and the upper level is enclosed, they each need their own mezuzah. What does that have to do with a room that has multiple entrances? So I think one way to understand it is that, I think this was in Rashi, that you could say that, well, the lower apartment also had a way to get in from the outside world. So it had multiple doors ways of getting into the apartment, and we're still saying that it would require multiple mezuzahs. We're not saying that, well, the main way to get into the apartment is through the front door, so therefore the stairwell shouldn't require mezuzah. We say, no, it does require mezuzah, i.e., even when there are multiple ways to get into a space, it will require multiple mezuzahs. Chavre, I want to keep on going just because it's Friday and I'm running super late, and these diagrams, these photos and stuff end up just taking a while to edit and compile and stuff, and I want to get that done earlier than later, so we're going to do one more scenario, and then we'll call it. Amra Ameimer says, Ameimer, Hai Pischa de Akarna, this opening in a corner, Chayiv b'mezuzah, requires a mezuzah. Amarle Rav Ashi la Meimer, says Rav Ashi ta Meimer, v'at leis le patzimin, but it doesn't have doorposts. Amarle adi patzime, these are the doorposts. What is this talking about? This is the final scenario that we're going to have today. So here is an example of a corner door. You see what's going on in here is that you have the blue arrow pointing to what I call the blue side, or whatever. We can even say the south side. Let's say, it's that's the south side, and if that's the south side, then that's going to be the west side. So you have the white arrow is no, I'm not talking about south and west now. No. But you have a square building, right? You have a square building. The blue arrow is pointing to one side of the square. The white arrow is pointing to another side of the square. And where is the entrance to the building? They basically cut out the corner. They chopped off the corner. And now, you see, in this scenario, this isn't exactly, as I said, in some of these we have to use our imagination a little bit. We're going to have to use our imagination a little bit here. In this scenario, of course, you'd be chayiv mezuzah, because this is clearly a tzuras HaPesach there, right? Where the pink arrow is pointing to, there's clearly a tzuras HaPesach over there. So if we just delete that, right? Click on it, delete it. Let's say we're imagining the blue side is just, and also it's much simpler, right? Just like we had by the H&M store in China, we had to imagine a much more primitive thing just to be able to think of in simple terms, to simplify things. This is a very beautiful, ornate, elaborate building. Let's simplify things. Just a simple brick or a stone wall, okay? In a simple place, not a fancy city like this. So the blue arrow is pointing to one side of our enclosure. The white arrow is pointing to another side of our enclosure. And it's just simply opened in the corner and you can walk right in. There's no fancy tzuras HaPesach like we have over here. You could just walk right in, okay? So we're saying, so what do we say? So again, Amar Meimer says, I pischa de akarna. So when you have an opening to a building, now I imagine that there's a roof on it, right? So I mean, it's not just like a fence. It's an opening to a house, but the opening is right in the corner like that, and you can walk right in. So chayiv b'mezuzah, you have to put up mezuzah. Amar le Rav Ashi. So says Rav Ashi, la meimer v'ha leis le patzimin, but there's no doorposts. Amar le adi patzime, to which a meimer says, no, these walls are the doorposts. You don't need any specific doorposts. You don't need anything fancy. These walls, the fact that I guess you have a tzuras HaPesach, right? I mean, you'll have, as we learned about Masechta Eruvin, right? You have one vertical, right? I guess this where the walls end is going on either side of the vertical, and then you have the roof on top of it. So we're saying that even though there's no fancy tzuras of Pesach like we have in this photo, it would be enough to be considered a doorway and would be chayav in a mezuzah. Right? So even though these walls are coming at like different angles and not facing each other, right? So I just read a note in the article, right? That meaning if you have like in the middle of a regular wall, just like in the middle of the wall, a door, so even without doorposts, it would still be considered a tzuras Pesach. But over here, since these two walls are coming from different directions, maybe there's a havmina to say that they're not facing each other. Even so, we're saying it would still be considered a tzuras Pesach and would be chayiv for a mezuzah. Friends, that was Daf Lamed Gimel, Daf 33 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, on Daf 33 of Masechta Menachos, we learned about some more halachos on writing a mezuzah. It can't be an igeris. It can't be 2 columns. We learned about determining which room is being entered. So the room where the pivot / doorpost is the room that is being entered, and the mezuzah will have to be on the right side when entering that room. A house is being entered when entering from the outside. We'll need the mezuzah will be on the right side when entering into the house. When there is a room between a house and a garden, we had said that Rabbi Yossi considers it like the house and it requires a mezuzah. The rabbis say it's like the garden, it doesn't require a mezuzah. Rav and Shmuel had said that the machlokas is davka when the pivot is outside. When the pivot is inside, everyone agrees it requires a mezuzah. When the pivot is outside, that's where Rabbi Yossi says it still requires a mezuzah, and the rabbis say it does not require a mezuzah. Rabbi and Rav Yosef say that the machlokas is dafka when the pivot is inside, but when the pivot is outside, everyone agrees you don't require a mezuzah, only when it is inside. Rabbi Yossi says it requires a mezuzah, and the rabbis say it does not. Placement of the mezuzah within the doorway, within the tefach closest to the outside, starting at the top third until 1 tefach from the lintel. It also needs to be on the right side, but we didn't learn about that specifically today. When multiple mezuzahs are required for a room, when all entrances are used, even if one of them is primary, but so long as all of them are used, you have to put mezuzahs on all of the doorways. It is not required if an entrance is private, as we saw by Rebbe, though again, I don't know what we say halacha l'maaseh. And we saw assorted mezuzah scenarios, all sort of interesting cases with different corners and all sorts of things. Friends, that was Daf Lamed Gimel of Masechta Menachos. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.